I'm Anna Gibson, 35, a senior consultant who built her career solving high-stakes problems for Fortune 500 clients and government contracts. For years, I was the sibling who wrote weekly letters during deployments, organized care packages, and made sure my veteran brother never felt forgotten. But when he looked me in the eye at a military ceremony and smirked, "In this room, you'll never be respected," I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might just surprise you. The changes started small. A roll of his eyes when I spoke at dinner. A dismissive laugh when I mentioned work challenges. At first, I told myself it was readjustment. He'd been overseas for 18 months, and coming home couldn't be easy. But as weeks turned to months, the pattern became unmistakable. My brother had returned from deployment with something sharp and cold where warmth used to be. Past the salt became, "Can you manage that?" when I reached for dishes at family gatherings. My opinions on news stories were met with that particular smirk he developed, the one that said he knew things I never would. When our parents asked about my promotion at the consulting firm, he'd interject with stories about real responsibility in the field, effectively redirecting every conversation away from my accomplishments. The most cutting moments happened in smaller groups. At our cousin's birthday party, when I mentioned the complexity of managing cross-functional teams, he laughed and said, "You wouldn't last a day with real authority." The room went quiet for a beat before conversation resumed, but I felt the words settle into my chest like stones. Our mother noticed it too. She'd give me these worried looks across the dinner table, especially after he'd make one of his comments. "He's still adjusting," she'd whisper when he stepped outside for phone calls. "Give him time." But I was starting to wonder if time was the issue, or if something fundamental had shifted in how he saw me, how he saw the world outside his military experience. The comments escalated in frequency and precision. He knew exactly where to aim. When I talked about difficult client negotiations, he'd mention how civilians didn't understand what real pressure felt like. When I expressed opinions about current events, he'd reference his deployment as if it granted him exclusive access to truth. Each remark felt calculated to remind me that in his new hierarchy of worth, I ranked somewhere near the bottom. I found myself editing my words before speaking, anticipating his responses. Family gatherings became exercises in avoidance. I'd arrive later, leave earlier, stick to safe topics about weather and movies. But even then, he'd find ways to inject his dismissiveness. A comment about my comfortable life here. A joke about how some people never faced real challenges. The breaking point came during a conversation about respect. We were helping Dad repair the back deck, and I mentioned feeling undervalued by a particular client who consistently dismissed my recommendations despite hiring me for my expertise. Instead of the brotherly support I'd once counted on, he stopped hammering and looked at me directly. "You want respect?" he said, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Try earning it somewhere that matters. Try earning it where it actually counts for something." I set down my tools and walked inside. Behind me, I heard Dad's quiet voice. That was unnecessary. But the damage was done. The brother who used to defend me from playground bullies had become something else entirely. He'd assigned me a place in his world, and apparently, it was nowhere. That night, I lay awake thinking about the boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd beg me to help with homework he couldn't finish, who'd cried into my shoulder when our grandfather died. That version of my brother felt like someone I'd invented, a story I'd told myself about unconditional family loyalty that had never actually existed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who'd written him letters every week during deployment. I was the one who'd organized care packages, coordinated family video calls, kept his favorite cookies stocked for when he came home on leave. I'd been proud of his service, genuinely proud. I'd bragged to colleagues about his dedication, shared stories about his leadership abilities. But somewhere in those 18 months overseas, he developed a worldview where civilian achievements didn't register as real accomplishments. where my 15 years of building a career, managing teams, navigating complex corporate politics, solving problems for major corporations, none of that constituted actual work. None of that earned actual respect. The worst part was how he made me doubt myself. After particularly harsh comments, I'd find myself questioning decisions I'd made confidently for years. Was I too soft in negotiations? Did I understand real pressure? Had I been coasting through challenges that weren't actually challenging? But then I'd remember the late nights spent untangling project disasters, the presentations to hostile boardrooms, the times I'd salvaged million-dollar deals through patience and strategic thinking. I'd remember the team members who'd followed me to new companies, the clients who requested me specifically, the industry recognition I'd earned through consistent performance. My brother had decided that none of that counted because it happened in conference rooms instead of combat zones. He'd assigned me a civilian-shaped box and stuffed me into it, regardless of what actually filled my days or defined my capabilities. Every interaction had become an opportunity for him to remind me of my supposed place in his newly rigid hierarchy. The saddest part was watching our parents navigate this new dynamic. They'd grown skilled at changing subjects when his comments got too sharp, at redirecting conversations away from potential flashpoints. Family dinners had become careful dances around topics that might trigger his condescension toward my career, my choices, my entire civilian existence. I started wondering if this was temporary or permanent. Would he eventually remember that respect used to flow both ways between us? Would he recognize that military service, however admirable, didn't grant him the right to dismiss everyone else's contributions to the world? Or had this become who he was now, someone who measured worth exclusively by proximity to combat, who saw civilian life as an extended childhood that people like me were too weak to graduate from? The pattern was clear now. Each conversation was a reminder that in his eyes, I'd never understand real responsibility, real pressure, real anything. He'd found a way to win every interaction by simply declaring that my experiences didn't count. And I was tired of losing arguments I'd never agreed to participate in. Something needed to change. I wasn't sure what or how, but I knew I couldn't keep shrinking every time he entered a room, couldn't keep qualifying my accomplishments in conversations with my own family. The brother I'd once known might be gone, but I was still here. And I was done apologizing for that. The invitation arrived on military letterhead, thick paper, formal language, an event celebrating the unit's return and achievements. My parents had been invited as family members, and by extension, so had I. "It'll be good," Mom said, clearly hoping this might be the bridge we needed. "You'll see him in his element. Maybe things will feel different there." I almost declined. The prospect of spending an evening surrounded by uniforms while my brother continued his campaign of dismissal felt exhausting. But something made me reconsider, maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity about what his element actually looked like. I bought a dress appropriate for the occasion and prepared myself for another evening of careful conversation. The base was imposing in the way military installations always are, all clean lines and purposeful architecture, everything suggesting efficiency and hierarchy. Cars filled the parking lot, families dressed in their best clothes walking toward the community center where the ceremony would be held. I felt immediately out of place, like I was wearing a costume to someone else's performance. Inside, the room buzzed with conversations I couldn't quite follow, references to operations, equipment, personnel changes, acronyms that might as well have been foreign language. Spouses clustered together, sharing experiences I'd never had. Children ran between tables, supervised by grandparents who clearly felt as peripheral as I did. The air smelled like coffee and industrial carpet, overlaid with the distinct scent of starch from all those pressed uniforms. My brother was in his element, exactly as Mom had predicted. He moved through the room with confidence I hadn't seen since before deployment, shaking hands, slapping backs, laughing at jokes that came from shared experience. This was his world now, these were his people. I watched from near the refreshment table, nursing a cup of bitter coffee and wondering why I'd come. He spotted me eventually, worked his way over with that familiar expression, not quite hostile, but certainly not welcoming. "Surprised you showed up," he said, adjusting his dress uniform jacket. "Not exactly your scene." I was invited, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Around us, conversations continued about deployments and transfers, families reuniting, promotions earned. I felt like an anthropologist studying a culture I'd never be part of. Yeah, well, don't expect much small talk about quarterly reports, he said, glancing around the room with satisfaction. These people understand what real work looks like. I nodded without responding, which seemed to encourage him. He gestured toward a group of soldiers near the far wall. See them? They've been through things you couldn't imagine. Made decisions under pressure you'll never face. His tone carried that familiar condescension, but amplified now by the setting. Here, surrounded by uniforms and military families, he had home field advantage. The ceremony began with speeches, officers talking about sacrifice, service, the successful completion of their mission. I listened respectfully, genuinely moved by stories of difficult conditions and dangerous work. These people had done something I never would, had faced challenges I'd never encounter. But my brother's running commentary made it impossible to simply appreciate their service. This is what respect actually looks like, he whispered during applause for particularly moving testimony. This is what people think about when they talk about real contribution. Each comment felt designed to remind me that I was a tourist in this world, that whatever accomplishments I might claim in my civilian life were irrelevant here. During the reception that followed, he introduced me to fellow soldiers with barely concealed amusement. This is my sister, he'd say. She works in consulting. The way he said consulting made it sound like a hobby, something people did to pass time between more serious pursuits. I shook hands, made polite conversation, and felt increasingly like an exhibit in a museum of civilian inadequacy. The breaking point came near the end of the evening. We were standing in a group that included several of his fellow soldiers and their families, everyone sharing stories about homecoming and adjustment. Someone mentioned the challenge of explaining military life to civilian friends, and the conversation turned to the gap between those who served and those who hadn't. It's hard to relate to people who've never really been tested, one soldier said, and others nodded in agreement. I felt myself becoming the unspoken example of such people, present but not really part of the conversation, civilian-shaped proof of their point. That's when my brother decided to make his position explicit. He turned to me with that smirk I'd come to dread, spoke just loud enough for the group to hear. In this room, you'll never be respected. The words hung in the air like smoke. He was laughing as he said it, as if it were a joke we all shared, but his eyes were serious. Around us, conversation quieted slightly, people uncertain whether to laugh or change the subject. I felt heat rise in my face, but something in me refused to shrink this time. Instead of looking away or making excuses to leave, I held his gaze. Let him see that his words had landed, but also that they wouldn't break me. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone present. Anyway, someone said finally, launching into a story about their own transition home. The moment passed, but the words remained. In this room, you'll never be respected. He'd said it like a fact, like a rule of physics that applied specifically to me. And maybe he was right about this particular room, but something in me refused to accept that his room was the only one that mattered. The evening ended with more handshakes and polite goodbyes, families streaming toward the parking lot under fluorescent lights. I walked to my car in silence, my brother trailing several steps behind with our parents. The gulf between us felt wider than ever, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to bridge it. Maybe some distances were meant to be preserved. We'd been inseparable once. In childhood photos, we're always touching, his arm around my shoulder, my hand on his back, both of us grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of kids who assume they'll always be each other's favorite person. Looking at those pictures now feels like examining archaeological evidence of a civilization that vanished without leaving clear explanations for its collapse. I was 3 years older, which in childhood terms made me alternately his protector and his tormentor, depending on the situation and my mood. When neighborhood kids picked on him for being smaller, I'd step in with the fierce authority that only big sisters possess. Leave him alone, I'd say, and somehow they always did. But I was equally capable of reducing him to tears myself, holding his favorite toy just out of reach or convincing him that vegetables were actually disguised candy that would taste better if he ate them quickly. The protection instinct was stronger, though. I taught him to ride a bike by running alongside him through our entire neighborhood, my hand on his back until he was steady enough to go solo. When he had nightmares about monsters in his closet, I'd check every corner with exaggerated thoroughness before declaring his room officially monster-free. I helped him with math homework at the Kit Gibson table, patiently explaining concepts until they clicked. He worshipped me in the way younger siblings do when the age gap hits that sweet spot, old enough for me to seem wise and capable, young enough for him to still need my help with everything. Ask my sister was his solution to every problem that stumped him. Couldn't reach something on a high shelf? Ask my sister. Needed help with a school project? Ask my sister. Wanted permission for something our parents might reject? Ask my sister to ask for you. When he joined Little League, I attended every game, cheering from bleachers that burned my legs in summer heat. When he got his first bloody nose in a playground fight, I walked him to the school nurse, holding tissues to his face and promising the other kid would be sorry. I was fierce in his defense, proud of his victories, protective of his vulnerabilities in the way that only family can be. The military recruiter visited our high school during his senior year, and I watched him transform during that conversation. He came home energized in a way I hadn't seen since his baseball team made regionals. They want people who can lead, he told me that night, eyes bright with possibility. They think I have what it takes. I was proud of him, genuinely proud. The military seemed like a perfect fit for someone who'd always thrived on structure and clear expectations. He'd struggled sometimes with the ambiguity of civilian life, the gray areas, the multiple right answers, the situations where you had to navigate without clear rules. The military promised clarity. This is right, this is wrong, this is what we expect, this is how you succeed. During his training, I sent letters every week like I'd promised. Long letters, full of family news and encouragement, updates about home, and questions about his experience. He wrote back sporadically, short messages about how hard the training was, how different everything felt, how much he was learning. I framed his graduation photo and put it on my dresser, this serious-looking young man in uniform who still somehow looked like the kid I'd taught to ride a bike. His first deployment felt surreal. My little brother, who used to be afraid of thunderstorms, was now carrying weapons in a foreign country, making decisions that mattered in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. I worried constantly but tried not to let it show in my letters. Instead, I sent care packages full of his favorite snacks, magazines, and photos from home. I organized video calls with the whole family, coordinated holiday packages, kept him connected to the life he'd temporarily left behind. The pride I felt was complicated but real. This was my brother doing something genuinely important, something that mattered beyond personal advancement or financial success. While I was navigating office politics and client presentations, he was serving his country in ways that required genuine sacrifice. The disparity didn't diminish my own work in my mind, but it did make me deeply respectful of his choice. When he came home on leave, he seemed older, but still fundamentally himself. He told stories about the people he'd met, the places he'd seen, the challenges he'd faced. Some stories were funny, some were serious, some he clearly couldn't or wouldn't tell. But he still seemed like my brother, changed by experience, but not transformed into someone unrecognizable. The longer deployment was different. 18 months in a more dangerous region, with communications more limited and stakes that felt higher. My letters continued, but his responses became even shorter, more focused on practical concerns than emotional connection. When we managed video calls, he looked tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. Still, I assumed this was temporary, the natural result of stress and distance that would resolve itself once he came home permanently. I planned for his homecoming like other people plan weddings. His favorite meal, his favorite dessert, decorations throughout the house, all his friends invited for a proper celebration. I wanted him to feel welcomed back into civilian life, surrounded by people who'd missed him and were proud of what he'd accomplished. I wanted to bridge the gap that distance and deployment had created between us. But the person who came home wasn't quite the brother I'd been writing to. The changes were subtle at first: less eye contact, shorter responses to questions, a tendency to retreat to his room after family dinners rather than lingering to talk like he used to. I told myself it was readjustment, that anyone would need time to transition back to civilian rhythms after such intense experiences. The dismissiveness started slowly, almost gently. Comments about my quiet life here at home, observations about how comfortable everything was in civilian society. At first, they felt like neutral observations rather than criticisms. But gradually, the tone shifted. My work became paperwork. My challenges became first-world problems. My accomplishments became evidence of how easy civilian life was compared to what he'd experienced overseas. The brother who once asked for my advice on everything stopped asking for my opinion on anything. The person who used to seek my approval for decisions now seemed to view my perspective as fundamentally irrelevant. Somewhere in those 18 months of deployment, he'd concluded that civilian experience, my experience, simply didn't count as real life. And once he'd made that determination, our entire relationship had to be recalibrated around his new understanding of what mattered and what didn't. I kept trying to reconnect with the person I'd known, the brother who used to think I was the smartest, most capable person in his world. But that version of him seemed to be gone, replaced by someone who'd decided I was exactly the opposite, a civilian who'd never been tested, never faced real challenges, never earned the kind of respect that actually mattered. The boy who once worshipped me had become a man who pitied me, and I wasn't sure which one of us had changed more. His words followed me home that night and settled into my thoughts like unwelcome house guests. In this room, you'll never be respected. I replayed the moment obsessively, his smirk, the way conversation had paused around us, the careful resumption of small talk that signaled everyone's discomfort with what he'd said. But mostly, I replayed my own response, or lack thereof. I'd stood there, silent, while he declared my irrelevance to a room full of strangers. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by imagined conversations where I said all the things I hadn't said in the moment. Clever comebacks, pointed observations about respect and how it's earned, reminders of everything I'd accomplished in my supposedly insignificant civilian life. In my 3 a.m. revision of events, I was eloquent and cutting, reducing him to embarrassed silence while the room erupted in supportive applause. Reality, as always, had been far less satisfying. The next morning brought a different kind of clarity, the exhausting recognition that I'd been having this argument with him for months, just never out loud. Every family dinner had become a subtle negotiation around his dismissiveness. Every conversation had been edited through the filter of his apparent contempt for civilian achievement. I'd been walking on eggshells in my own family, trying to avoid triggering his lectures about real work and real challenges and real respect. But something about the public nature of his comment had shifted my perspective. It was one thing for him to diminish me privately, quite another to do it in front of strangers at a military ceremony. He'd used his service as a platform to humiliate me, and I found myself angry in a way that felt clean and energizing rather than confused and hurt. I started thinking about respect, what it actually meant, how it was actually earned, whether his version was the only one that mattered. In my work, respect came through consistency, expertise, the ability to solve complex problems under pressure, the track record of delivering results when clients needed them most. It came through managing teams effectively, building trust over time, developing a reputation for competence that led to increased responsibility and recognition. None of that had disappeared because my brother decided it wasn't real. The clients who specifically requested my involvement in their projects hadn't been confused about my capabilities. The team members who'd followed me to new companies hadn't been mistaken about my leadership skills. The industry recognition I'd received hadn't been some elaborate civilian participation trophy. His deployment had been genuinely difficult, genuinely meaningful, genuinely worthy of respect. But that didn't automatically make my different kind of challenges meaningless. We weren't competing in the same arena, weren't trying to solve the same problems, weren't serving the same populations. The fact that he'd faced physical danger didn't negate the fact that I'd built something valuable through different kinds of risk and dedication. I thought about our childhood, how I'd been the one he turned to when he needed help, advice, protection, encouragement. That version of me hadn't become less capable or less worthy of respect. If anything, the years since then had added layers of confidence and experience he'd never seen me demonstrate. But he decided that civilian competence simply didn't count, and once he'd made that decision, no amount of evidence to the contrary would change his mind. The anger was useful because it burned away the self-doubt his comments had been generating. For months, I'd been questioning my own accomplishments through the lens of his dismissiveness. Was my work really that easy? Were my challenges really that insignificant? Had I been coasting through a life that wasn't actually demanding? His certainty had been infectious, making me wonder if I'd been overestimating my own capabilities all along. But anger clarified things. The work was as challenging as I'd always known it to be. The accomplishments were as real as they'd always been. The respect I'd earned in my professional life was as valid as any other kind of respect, including the military variety my brother seemed to think was the only legitimate form. I realized I'd been trying to win his approval using metrics he'd already decided didn't matter. It was like trying to prove my worth in a game where he kept changing the rules to ensure I couldn't succeed. No amount of professional achievement would impress someone who decided that professional achievement was inherently worthless. No demonstration of civilian leadership would matter to someone convinced that civilian leadership was a contradiction in terms. The recognition was liberating in an unexpected way. I could stop trying to translate my accomplishments into terms he might respect and start remembering why they'd mattered to me in the first place. I could stop editing my conversations to avoid triggering his lectures about real work and start talking about my actual experiences again. I could stop shrinking in his presence and start taking up the space I'd always been entitled to occupy. But liberation came with its own kind of sadness. It meant accepting that the brother who used to think I was capable of anything had been replaced by someone who thought I was capable of nothing that mattered. It meant acknowledging that the relationship I'd been trying to preserve was already gone, had probably been gone since he came home with his new hierarchy of worth firmly in place. I started thinking about the military ceremony differently too. Yes, it had been his world, filled with his people, organized around values and experiences I'd never share. But that didn't make it the only world that mattered, or the only place where respect could be meaningfully earned. It was one community among many, one way of contributing among many, one form of service among many different forms of service. His comment had been designed to put me in my place, to remind me that in his newly constructed universe, I had no place at all. But maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need a place in his universe. Maybe I already had places that mattered more, places where my contributions were valued, where my capabilities were recognized, where respect was based on what I actually did rather than what uniform I wore or what dangers I'd faced. The hurt was still there, probably always would be. It's one thing to lose the approval of a stranger, quite another to lose the respect of someone who used to be your closest ally. But underneath the hurt was something steadier, the knowledge that his opinion, however painful to hear, didn't actually define my worth or determine my value. He could keep his room where I'd never be respected. I had other rooms, better rooms, rooms where I belonged completely. The decision formed slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. I wasn't going to defend myself anymore, wasn't going to explain or justify or try to translate civilian accomplishments into military terms he might respect. I wasn't going to shrink or apologize or edit my presence to make him more comfortable with his dismissiveness. If he needed me to be small to feel large, that was his limitation, not mine. The shift felt subtle, but significant, a straightening of shoulders, a steadiness in eye contact, a refusal to flinch when he launched into his lectures about real work and real challenges. I'd spent months trying to avoid triggering his condescension, carefully steering conversations away from topics that might provoke his commentary about civilian inadequacy. But why was his comfort my responsibility? Why should I manage his feelings about my existence? At the next family dinner, when he started in on his usual routine about people who'd never been tested, I didn't change the subject. I didn't offer conciliatory agreement about how comfortable civilian life was compared to military service. I just continued eating, maintained neutral eye contact, and let his words hang in the air without rushing to fill the silence with apologies for my apparent inadequacy. The non-reaction seemed to confuse him. He was accustomed to getting a response, either defensive argument or embarrassed retreat. My calm neutrality robbed him of the satisfaction he'd been deriving from these interactions. When provocation doesn't provoke, what's the point of continuing? I started talking about my work again, not to prove anything to him, but because pretending it didn't exist had been exhausting. When family members asked about projects, I answered directly instead of deflecting. When I had opinions about current events, I shared them instead of staying silent to avoid his lectures about civilian ignorance. I reclaimed space in conversations I'd been ceding to avoid conflict. His responses escalated initially. If quiet dismissiveness hadn't been enough to keep me in my designated place, he'd try louder dismissiveness. Comments about my comfortable lifestyle became pointed observations about people who'd never faced real consequences. Jokes about civilian softness became explicit comparisons between his deployment experiences and my easy, professional challenges. But I'd found something he couldn't touch: indifference to his approval. Not the bitter kind of indifference that's really hurt in disguise, but genuine recognition that his opinion had become irrelevant to my sense of self-worth. He could think whatever he wanted about civilian life, civilian work, civilian courage. His thoughts on these subjects simply didn't matter to me anymore. The change was most apparent during conversations about respect. He'd built an entire worldview around the idea that respect had to be earned through specific types of sacrifice, specific forms of service, specific kinds of risk. Anyone who hadn't met his criteria was permanently relegated to second-class status in his moral universe. But I'd realized that his criteria were arbitrary, self-serving, and ultimately meaningless outside the small circle of people who shared his particular experiences. Real respect, I'd come to understand, wasn't something you demanded or legislated or assigned based on resume items. It emerged organically from interactions over time, from consistency between values and actions, from the way someone treated other people when they had nothing to gain from being decent. It couldn't be manufactured through uniform choices or deployment stories, and it couldn't be revoked by someone who decided your challenges didn't count as real challenges. I started noticing how he interacted with other family members, other civilians, other people whose contributions didn't fit his narrow definition of meaningful service. The same dismissiveness was there, just less focused, because they weren't his sister and therefore not as personally invested in his approval. He developed a general contempt for civilian life that extended far beyond our specific relationship. That recognition was oddly comforting. His attitude toward me wasn't really about me. It was about his need to maintain a worldview where his choices were not just good, but exclusively good, where his form of service was not just valuable, but uniquely valuable, where his experiences were not just difficult, but incomparably difficult. I'd become collateral damage in his construction of meaning around his military service. Understanding his psychology didn't make his behavior acceptable, but it did make it less personal. He wasn't dismissing me because of who I was or what I'd done or failed to do. He was dismissing me because I represented a category of person he decided was inherently less worthy of respect. It was prejudice dressed up as moral clarity, and recognizing it as such made it easier to reject. I also started thinking about the military families I'd met at the ceremony, the ones who'd seemed genuinely kind and interested in connection rather than establishing hierarchies of worth. His attitude wasn't representative of military culture as a whole, it was representative of his particular personality applied to military experience. Plenty of service members managed to honor their own contributions without diminishing everyone else's. The real test would come the next time he tried to put me in my designated place. I was curious to see how he'd respond to my refusal to stay there, to my insistence on occupying space he decided I wasn't entitled to fill. Would he escalate until I retreated, or would he eventually get bored with a game where the other player refused to acknowledge the rules? I suspected he'd be persistent. People who derive satisfaction from making others feel small don't usually give up easily when their target stops cooperating. But I also suspected that persistence without payoff would eventually exhaust itself. If I couldn't be diminished, what was the point of trying to diminish me? The decision felt final and freeing. I was done managing his comfort with my existence, done apologizing for accomplishments he decided didn't count, done shrinking to make room for his inflated sense of superiority. If he wanted to respect only people who'd had his specific experiences, that was his choice. But I wasn't going to pretend that his respect was the only kind that mattered, or that its absence said anything meaningful about my actual worth. The ceremony was smaller this time, more intimate, a recognition event for the unit's leadership rather than the large homecoming celebration from months before. The invitation had specified family members, and despite everything that had happened between us, I decided to attend. Not as an olive branch or attempt at reconciliation, but as a test of my newfound indifference to his opinion. Could I stand in his world without feeling diminished by it? The venue was the same community center, but the atmosphere felt different with fewer people. Conversations were quieter, more focused, groups smaller and more tightly knit. I recognized some faces from the previous event: spouses, parents, siblings of service members who'd earned recognition for leadership during deployment. Everyone dressed respectfully, speaking in measured tones appropriate for an occasion celebrating achievement. My brother looked confident as always in this environment, moving easily between conversations, comfortable with the formal protocols and military courtesies that governed these gatherings. He was being recognized tonight, something about exceptional leadership during a particularly challenging operation. I felt proud of him, genuinely proud, despite everything that had transpired between us. His service was real, his accomplishments meaningful, his contributions worthy of celebration. But my pride didn't require diminishing myself anymore. I could appreciate his achievements without accepting his assessment of my worth. The two things weren't connected in my mind the way they seemed to be in his. His success didn't negate my success, his service didn't invalidate my contributions, his respect from military colleagues didn't make civilian respect meaningless. He spotted me near the reception area and approached with that familiar expression, not quite welcoming, but not openly hostile either. More like resigned acknowledgement of my presence in his face. "Surprised to see you again," he said, adjusting his dress uniform. "Twice in 1 year at military events. That's got to be some kind of record for you." I was invited, I replied calmly, the same response I'd given at the previous ceremony. But this time, I felt no need to justify my presence further or apologize for not being more regular attendee at military functions. I belonged wherever I'd been invited, regardless of his comfort level with my attendance. "Right," he said, glancing around the room. "Well, try not to look too lost. These people take this stuff seriously." I nodded without responding, which seemed to surprise him slightly. He'd been expecting some kind of defensive reaction, some evidence that his comment had landed with its intended effect. When none came, he hesitated briefly before moving on to conversations with people who would respond more predictably to his provocations. The evening proceeded with familiar rhythms, speeches about service and sacrifice, stories about specific incidents that had tested the unit, recognition for individuals who demonstrated exceptional leadership under pressure. I listened respectfully, genuinely moved by accounts of difficult decisions made under dangerous conditions. These people had done something I never would, faced challenges I'd never encounter. That didn't diminish my own different challenges, but it did make their accomplishments worthy of respect and recognition. During the reception that followed, I found myself in conversation with other family members, parents proud of their children's service, spouses managing the complexities of military life, siblings navigating their own relationships with service members. The conversations were easier this time, partly because I felt more confident in my right to be there, partly because I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. My brother appeared periodically in my peripheral vision, sometimes catching my eye across the room with expressions I couldn't quite read. Maybe confusion about my apparent comfort in his environment, maybe disappointment that I wasn't playing my assigned role as the uncomfortable civilian. I'd stopped trying to interpret his expressions or anticipate his reactions. Whatever he was thinking about my presence was his business, not mine. The moment came, as I'd somehow known it would, during a lull in the formal program. We were standing in a loose group of family members and service members, the kind of mixed conversation that happens at these events when the official ceremonies wind down and people settle into more casual interaction. Someone was telling a story about the challenges of readjusting to civilian life after deployment, and others were sharing their own experiences and observations. The conversation turned, as it often did in these settings, to the differences between military and civilian life, the gap in understanding between those who'd served and those who hadn't. It was familiar territory by now, the kind of discussion that always made me feel like an exhibit in a museum of civilian inadequacy. But this time, instead of retreating or trying to change the subject, I simply listened without feeling defensive. That's when my brother decided to make his position explicit once again. He looked directly at me, that familiar smirk playing around his mouth, and repeated the exact words he'd used months before. "In this room, you'll never be respected." The comment was delivered like a punchline to a joke everyone understood, designed to put me back in the designated place I'd been refusing to occupy. But instead of the embarrassed silence or defensive response he'd gotten before, I met his gaze steadily and simply waited. No flinch, no retreat, no attempt to laugh it off or redirect the conversation. Just calm acknowledgement that he'd said something designed to hurt me, and complete indifference to whether it succeeded. The silence stretched longer this time, more uncomfortable for everyone present. People shifted slightly, glanced at each other, seemed uncertain about how to respond to such naked hostility disguised as casual observation. My brother's smirk wavered slightly as the moment extended beyond what he'd expected, beyond what felt socially acceptable even in a room full of people who might theoretically agree with his sentiment. I realized I was no longer the same person who'd been humiliated by those words months ago. That version of me had needed his approval, had been devastated by his dismissal, had spent weeks questioning her own worth through the lens of his contempt. This version of me simply didn't care what he thought about civilian respect or military respect or any other kind of respect he wanted to lecture about. Anyway, someone finally said, launching into a different topic entirely. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. My brother had played his trump card, his definitive statement about my place in his world, and it had fallen flat. Without my cooperation in feeling diminished, his dismissiveness lost its power. Without my investment in his approval, his withholding of it became meaningless. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. I stayed until the end, participated in conversations, congratulated him on his recognition, behaved exactly like someone who belonged at such events. Because I did belong, not because of any connection to military service, but because I'd been invited, because I was a family member of someone being honored, because I was a human being capable of respectful participation in other people's meaningful moments. Walking to the parking lot afterward, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity for my brother. He'd constructed an entire worldview that required him to diminish other people in order to feel good about himself. He'd turned his genuinely admirable service into a weapon for attacking anyone who'd served differently or not at all. He'd made respect into a zero-sum game where his having it required others not having it. That wasn't strength or wisdom or legitimate pride in meaningful accomplishment. It was insecurity dressed up as superiority, neediness disguised as independence. He needed me to feel small so he could feel large, needed civilian contributions to be meaningless so his contributions could be uniquely meaningful. But strength doesn't require other people's weakness, and real confidence doesn't demand other people's insecurity. I drove home thinking about rooms and respect and who gets to decide what counts. He declared that in his room, I'd never be respected, as if his room were the only one that mattered, as if his definition of respect were the only legitimate one. But I had other rooms where my contributions were valued, where my capabilities were recognized, where respect was based on actual interaction rather than preconceived categories. More importantly, I had my own room, my own sense of self-worth that didn't depend on his or anyone else's validation. That room was always available to me, always welcoming, always filled with accurate assessment of my actual capabilities and contributions. In that room, I would always be respected, because I knew what I'd accomplished and what it had required and what it meant to the people it had helped. His room was smaller than he realized, populated only by people who shared his exact experiences and agreed with his narrow definitions of worth. My room was larger, more inclusive, more interesting. I preferred it there, and I was done visiting his. The silence that followed felt different from awkward social pauses I'd experienced before. This wasn't the brief hesitation of people searching for new topics or processing unexpected information. This was the heavy quiet that settles when someone crosses a line so obviously that everyone present recognizes the transgression, even if they're not sure how to respond to it. My brother's expression shifted from confident dismissiveness to something approaching uncertainty. He delivered his line with practiced timing, expecting the same result he'd gotten before: my discomfort, the group's tacit agreement, the subtle reinforcement of his position in whatever hierarchy he'd constructed in his mind. Instead, he got steady eye contact and complete indifference to his opinion. I realized in that moment that his comment hadn't been meant for the room at all. It had been meant for me, designed to reestablish control over a dynamic that had been slipping away from him for months. He'd watched me grow more comfortable in settings like this, more willing to take up space he'd decided I wasn't entitled to occupy, more resistant to his attempts to diminish my sense of belonging anywhere he considered important. But the weapon he'd been using against me, my need for his approval, my investment in family harmony, my desire to be respected by someone whose respect I'd once valued, had become ineffective. I'd stopped caring about his assessment of my worth, stopped measuring myself against his arbitrary standards, stopped trying to win a game where he controlled all the rules and changed them whenever I got close to succeeding. The conversation around us resumed eventually, other people working to restore social equilibrium after his uncomfortable declaration. Someone mentioned upcoming holiday plans, someone else asked about duty assignments, normal topics that allowed everyone to pretend the previous exchange hadn't happened. But the damage was done, and not in the way my brother had intended. Instead of establishing his dominance over me, he'd revealed something ugly about himself to people whose opinions he actually cared about. Military families weren't uniformly dismissive of civilian contributions the way he seemed to be. Many of them had civilian careers themselves, civilian friends, civilian family members they loved and respected. His blanket dismissal of civilian worth wasn't military wisdom, it was personal prejudice that happened to be expressed in military language. I watched him try to recover his footing in subsequent conversations, working harder than usual to demonstrate his expertise, his insider knowledge, his legitimate place in this community. But there was a quality of overcompensation now, a slight desperation in his need to prove himself that hadn't been there before. When your power depends on other people's weakness, what happens when they refuse to be weak for you? Near the end of the evening, as people began gathering coats and saying goodbyes, something extraordinary happened. A man in dress uniform approached our area, older than the other soldiers present, more decorations on his chest. The kind of bearing that suggested significant authority even to someone like me who couldn't read military rank insignia with any precision. My brother straightened immediately, his entire demeanor shifting into high alert. "General Morrison," he said, his voice carrying a formality I'd never heard from him before. Around us, conversations quieted as other people noticed the senior officer's presence. This was clearly someone whose attention carried weight, whose recognition mattered in ways that went beyond polite social acknowledgement. The general nodded to my brother with the kind of professional courtesy senior officers extend to junior personnel, respectful but not particularly personal. Then his attention shifted, scanning the small group of family members standing nearby. His gaze settled on me with what seemed like recognition, though I was certain we'd never met. "Excuse me," he said, addressing me directly while my brother watched in confusion. "Are you Anna Gibson from Morrison Strategic Consulting?" The question caught me completely off guard. Morrison Strategic, the name clicked into place suddenly. This was General Morrison, retired from active duty, now running one of the most respected defense consulting firms in the region. I'd heard his name mentioned in industry publications, seen his company referenced in contract announcements, but never made the connection to tonight's ceremony. I replied, extending my hand for what I assumed would be a polite business handshake. Instead, he came to attention and saluted me with the same crisp precision I'd seen him use with active duty personnel. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely outside anything I'd anticipated happening at a military ceremony, that I almost stepped backward in surprise. "Ma'am," he said, holding the salute for a beat longer than seemed necessary. "It's an honor." My brother's face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before: confusion, disbelief, something approaching shock. The confident smirk that had been his default expression around me for months had vanished entirely, replaced by the kind of stunned silence that follows events that don't fit any existing mental categories. "General Morrison," I managed, though I wasn't sure whether I should return the salute or simply shake his hand or stand there looking as bewildered as I felt. "I didn't realize, thank you, but I'm not sure your work on the logistics optimization project saved us millions," he said, relaxing from the salute but maintaining his formal tone. "More importantly, it saved time we didn't have during a critical deployment window." That was exceptional analysis under significant pressure. The room around us had gone quiet again, but this time the silence carried different weight. People were listening not because someone had said something inappropriate, but because they were witnessing something unexpected and significant. My brother stood frozen beside me, apparently incapable of processing what he was seeing. I remembered the project now, a complex analysis of supply chain vulnerabilities for a major defense contractor, work that had consumed 6 months of 18-hour days and required coordination between multiple agencies and private firms. It had been challenging, exhausting, important work, but I'd never known how it connected to actual military operations. I certainly hadn't expected it to earn recognition from a general at a small military ceremony. "That project was a team effort," I said, finding my voice again. "We had excellent cooperation from your people, and the client provided clear priorities. It was challenging work, but that's what made it interesting." "Challenging work," he repeated, nodding approvingly. That's one way to describe trying to untangle a logistics nightmare that had been developing for years while Congress breathed down everyone's neck about budget overruns. Your team identified problems we didn't even know we had and provided solutions that actually worked in the real world, not just on paper. My brother still hadn't spoken. He stood there staring at the general, then at me, then back at the general, as if he were watching a movie dubbed in a foreign language. The person who'd spent months explaining to me that civilian work wasn't real work, that civilian challenges weren't real challenges, that civilian contributions didn't earn real respect, was watching a general salute his sister for civilian work that had directly supported military operations. "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight," General Morrison continued. "Small world. But I'm glad I got the chance to thank you in person. Work like yours is exactly what we need more of: people who can think clearly under pressure and deliver results when it matters. Real results. Real pressure. Real work that earned real respect from someone whose opinion on such matters carried considerably more weight than my brother's." The irony was so complete it felt almost staged, as if the universe had decided to provide a definitive answer to months of argument about what counted as meaningful contribution. The silence that followed General Morrison's words felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, that suspended moment when you know something significant has happened, but the full impact hasn't reached you yet. My brother stood motionless, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. The confident dismissiveness he'd worn like armor for months had cracked completely, leaving something raw and confused underneath. "I should let you get back to your evening," General Morrison said, glancing around our small group with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested he understood he'd interrupted something. "But I meant what I said: exceptional work. The kind of analysis that makes real operations possible." He shook my hand once more, nodded respectfully to the others, and moved on to other conversations. Normal social rhythm resumed around us as people processed what they'd witnessed and returned to their own discussions about family, deployment, upcoming assignments. But our little corner of the room remained frozen, as if we were all waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. I looked at my brother, genuinely curious about how he'd integrate this new information into his worldview. For months, he'd been operating from the premise that civilian work was inherently less valuable than military service, that civilian challenges were softer than military challenges, that civilian achievements deserved less respect than military achievements. But he'd just watched a general, his general, someone whose opinion he clearly valued, salute me for civilian work that had directly supported military operations. "You never mentioned that project," he said finally, his voice carrying a tone I couldn't quite identify. Not accusatory exactly, but not neutral either. As if my failure to discuss classified defense work at family dinners had been some kind of deliberate deception. "It's not something I talk about," I replied honestly. "Most of my work involves confidential client information." "You know that?" Which he did know, because he'd used my discretion about client details as evidence of how unimportant my work must be. If it were really significant, his reasoning had gone, surely I'd be able to discuss it more freely. He nodded slowly, but I could see him struggling to reconcile the evening's events with the narrative he'd constructed about my professional irrelevance. The general hadn't been patronizing or politely supportive in the way that people sometimes are with family members of service personnel. He'd been genuinely respectful, even deferential, in a way that suggested my work had created real value for people whose missions mattered. "Logistics optimization," my brother repeated, as if testing the words. "That sounds like..." "Like what?" I asked when he didn't finish the sentence. "Like something that would actually matter. In real operations." The admission was small, grudging, but it represented a crack in the certainty he'd maintained about civilian irrelevance. If General Morrison respected my work, if it had contributed to successful military operations, if it had solved problems that mattered to people my brother respected, then maybe civilian work could be real work after all. Maybe civilian challenges could be real challenges. Maybe civilian contributions could earn real respect, even in rooms full of military personnel. "It was complex work," I said simply. "Lots of variables, tight deadlines, high stakes. The kind of project where mistakes have consequences." He nodded again, and I realized this was probably the first time in months that he'd listened to me describe professional challenges without immediately dismissing them as irrelevant civilian concerns. The general's recognition had forced him to reconsider his assumptions, to acknowledge that the work he'd been ridiculing might actually be important to the military operations he respected. The drive home passed in unusual quiet. We rode together because our parents had insisted on family unity for military events, and the silence felt different from the hostile tension that had characterized our interactions lately. He seemed to be thinking, processing, trying to fit new information into old categories that might not accommodate it gracefully. "I didn't know you worked on defense projects," he said as we pulled into our parents' driveway. "You never asked," I replied, which was true. His questions about my work had been rhetorical, designed to elicit descriptions he could then dismiss rather than genuine curiosity about what I actually did with my time and expertise. I assumed it was all corporate stuff. Marketing strategies, efficiency studies, that kind of thing. "It's all of that sometimes. It's whatever clients need analyzed." I paused, then decided honesty might be more useful than diplomacy. "You assumed it was unimportant because you decided civilian work was unimportant. You weren't interested in details that might contradict that assumption." He didn't respond immediately, but he didn't argue either. We sat in the car for a moment longer, both of us apparently reluctant to end a conversation that felt different from the ones we'd been having for months. "The general seemed to think it was important," he said finally. "The general understands that military operations depend on civilian expertise in lots of ways. Logistics, intelligence analysis, technology development, strategic planning. Most of the support structure that makes military missions possible comes from civilian contractors and consultants." I could see him working through the implications of that reality. If civilian expertise was essential to military success, then dismissing all civilian work as unimportant didn't make sense. If military leaders respected civilian contributions, then his blanket contempt for civilian achievements put him out of step with the very community he claimed to represent. "I guess I never thought about it that way," he admitted. "No," I agreed. "You didn't." We went inside to rejoin our parents, who were waiting with questions about the ceremony and obvious hope that the evening had gone well for both of us. I answered their questions about the recognition, the speeches, the general's unexpected acknowledgement of my work. My brother added his own observations, and for the first time in months, we managed to have a conversation about his military world that didn't require me to apologize for existing in a civilian one. It wasn't resolution exactly. Months of dismissiveness and contempt couldn't be erased by one evening's revelation. But it was recognition that his assumptions about civilian irrelevance had been wrong, at least partially wrong, at least wrong enough to require reconsideration. And that was more progress than I'd dared hope for. The person who'd declared that in military rooms I'd never be respected had watched a general salute me in exactly such a room. The brother who'd spent months explaining why civilian work didn't count had heard that work praised by someone whose opinion on military matters exceeded his own. Reality had contradicted his narrative so definitively that even he couldn't ignore the discrepancy. Whether he'd learn from that contradiction, whether he'd adjust his worldview to accommodate new information, whether he'd recognize that respect couldn't be monopolized by any single community or profession, those questions remained unanswered. But at least now he knew that his questions needed answering. The weeks that followed felt different, though the changes were subtle enough that I might have imagined them if I hadn't been paying attention. My brother didn't apologize. That would have required acknowledging that his months of dismissiveness had been wrong, and he wasn't ready for that level of self-reflection yet. But the constant undermining stopped, replaced by something closer to neutral coexistence. Family dinners became less tense as he stopped using every conversation as an opportunity to lecture about real work versus civilian work, real challenges versus comfortable problems, real respect versus the participation trophy version he decided I'd been receiving all my life. He still didn't show particular interest in my professional experiences, but he also stopped actively dismissing them when others brought them up. The shift was most apparent during a conversation about current events, when I offered an opinion about military strategy in a region I'd studied extensively for client work. Instead of his usual dismissive response about civilian ignorance of military realities, he listened and even asked follow-up questions. Not enthusiastic engagement exactly, but acknowledgement that my perspective might have value beyond serving as a foil for his expertise. "You really study this stuff," he said afterward, as if the idea that civilian analysts might develop genuine expertise about military-related topics had never occurred to him before. "It's part of the work," I replied. Understanding context, knowing the history, recognizing patterns, you can't do useful analysis without background knowledge. He nodded thoughtfully, and I realized this might be the first time he'd considered that civilian work supporting military operations required actual competence rather than just bureaucratic busy work. The general's recognition had forced him to confront the possibility that dismissing all civilian contributions as meaningless might have been an oversimplification. But the deeper issues remained unresolved. He still seemed to view military service as inherently more valuable than civilian contributions, still talked about deployment experiences as if they were the only valid test of character or capability, still carried himself with the assumption that his form of service granted him moral authority over people who'd served differently or not at all. The difference was that he'd become less aggressive about asserting that authority, less insistent on diminishing other people's contributions to establish his own superiority. Maybe he was beginning to recognize that strength didn't require other people's weakness, that his accomplishments could be meaningful without everyone else's being meaningless. I found myself cautiously optimistic that this might represent actual growth rather than temporary retreat. If he could acknowledge that civilian expertise had value in military contexts, maybe he could eventually acknowledge that it had value in other contexts too. If he could respect work that supported military operations, maybe he could eventually respect work that supported other important goals. But optimism came tempered with realism about how much people could change, especially when change required admitting they'd been wrong about fundamental assumptions. My brother had built his post-deployment identity around being someone who understood things that civilians couldn't understand, who'd faced challenges that civilians couldn't face, who'd earned respect that civilians couldn't earn. Abandoning that identity would require more than adjusting his opinion about my specific work. It would require reconstructing his entire understanding of worth and contribution and what made someone deserving of respect. That kind of fundamental reconsideration was possible but difficult, especially for someone who'd invested months in defending positions that were becoming harder to justify. I decided not to push for dramatic reconciliation or explicit acknowledgement of past wrongs. The absence of active hostility felt like progress worth preserving, even if it fell short of genuine understanding or renewed closeness. Maybe this was simply what our relationship would be now, polite distance maintained by mutual agreement to avoid topics that had become too charged for productive discussion. Our parents seemed relieved by the reduction in tension, even if they couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Family gatherings became less carefully orchestrated around potential conflict. Conversations flowed more naturally without constant vigilance about triggering his lectures about civilian inadequacy. It wasn't the warm family dynamic we'd once shared, but it was sustainable in ways the previous months hadn't been. I also noticed changes in how I carried myself, independent of his behavior modifications. The months of defending my worth against his dismissiveness had clarified things about respect and confidence that I might never have understood otherwise. I'd learned the difference between approval and respect, between validation and self-worth, between being valued by others and valuing myself. His attacks on civilian work had forced me to examine why I found that work meaningful, what made it challenging, how it contributed to outcomes that mattered to people beyond myself. The process of defending my choices had helped me understand them more clearly, had strengthened my conviction that the work was worth doing well regardless of who recognized or appreciated the effort involved. Most importantly, I discovered that his respect wasn't actually necessary for my sense of professional competence or personal worth. That discovery had been painful, losing the approval of someone whose opinion I'd valued, but it had also been liberating. I'd learned to find validation in the work itself, in the results it produced, in the recognition it earned from people who understood what it required. The general salute had been gratifying, but it hadn't been necessary. By the time it happened, I'd already reclaimed my sense of professional pride from my brother's attempts to diminish it. The external validation was nice, but the internal validation was more important and more lasting. I'd learned that respect was something I could give myself, something that didn't depend on other people's assessment of my worth or their approval of my choices. My brother could keep his narrow definition of what counted as meaningful contribution. I had my own definition, broader and more inclusive, and I preferred it to his. The distance between us felt permanent now, but not necessarily tragic. We'd grown into different people with different values, different priorities, different ways of understanding what made life meaningful. That could be acceptable as long as we could coexist respectfully, even if we couldn't reconnect intimately. Maybe that was enough. Maybe not every relationship could survive the changes that time and experience brought to people, and maybe that was okay. Maybe the goal wasn't to preserve childhood closeness, but to develop adult civility, to find ways of caring about each other without requiring each other to be different than we'd become. The boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms was gone, replaced by a man whose worldview I couldn't share but whose right to hold it I could respect. The girl who'd protected him from bullies was gone too, replaced by a woman who'd learned to protect herself from dismissiveness, including his. We were different people now, and maybe that was simply how growing up worked sometimes. That moment taught me something simple but powerful. Respect isn't granted by titles or uniforms, it's earned by actions, and it can come from the most unexpected places. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only for life to flip the script? Did you ever get respect from someone you least expected it from? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this hit home, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories about standing tall when others try to cut you down.